This week on Peter and Friends, we talk about your money. That's right. I didn't change it. I kind of changed the name of the show. I did just for today. Why? Because we're doing it with friends this week. That's my friends this week on the Peter and Friends, the Pete the Planner Show, are of course producer Nicole. Hello, producer Nicole.
Hello, Pete.
And Skyping in live from DeKalb County, Indiana. What else is he gonna do? Damian Dunn, lead concierge at Your Money Line. Hey, buddy.
Hey, Pete.
Was that insulting?
Probably.
All right, let's get started. Here's how the show works. You email us your questions, ask Pete at PeteThePlanner.com. We answer your questions here on the air, and if you had emailed us the question, we will then email you the audio or hope that you've listened to the show. It's a little complicated. Here's what we have this week, friends. We've got a question about a 401k allocation. We've got one of the craziest work reimbursement questions, work expense reimbursement questions I've ever seen. In the next segment, and then the third segment, we're going to hit another investment question as well as listener feedback, which is fun. And then finally, biggest waste of money of the week. Let's get started. Hey, Pete and friends, I noticed when logging into my 401k recently that the YTD, Nicole, you know what YTD is?
No, what is that?
Year to date.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But you can sound like really cool. Like if you're at your hipster parties tonight with your millennials, you'd be like, you guys see what the S&P have done YTD? Just say that, and everyone's like, is that a new IPA? Right?
Right. I think I heard about that.
Recently, my YTD on my personalized rate of return is only 3.9%, even though I'm in the aggressive model. This surprised me a bit, given what the S&P is doing. As I'm reading through this, Damien, can you just grab up the latest S&P YTD? I did some digging, and some international funds are the cause for the lag as compared to the S&P. Diversification can work for you or against you. Am I right? He did write that in the email, which I think is pretty great. So then I did some rough 10-year comparisons. I've always been in the aggressive model, and annualized, and I am lagging the S&P by almost 2 full percentage points. Fees are not the culprit, as I work for a financial firm, and all of the share classes for the funds in our plans offer very low fees. I have a brokerage account where I only own 3 ETFs, 60% total U.S. stock, 30% international, and 10% aggregate bond. So that is a bit less diversified. I also own a number of rental houses. My wife works in the school system and thus will one day collect a decent pension. In your opinion, is it silly to remain diversified within my 401k rather than just letting it all ride in an S&P index fund? Or should I somewhat protect myself with a diversification given my other investments? Like you, I am 40 and bald. Thanks for that, buddy. And I plan to be done working by 55 at the latest. Thanks, man. Love the podcast. And this is from Austin. All right, Damien, what's the S&P YTD?
9.62, Peter.
Okay. Do you just call me Peter?
Yeah,
I
I
did.
did.
That was weird.
It was weird.
It's like my mom. Okay, so the S&P is almost outpacing this portfolio by 3 times almost. What he's talking about, 3.9%, 2.5 times. So what do you think, Damien? I'll toss to you, Mr. CFP. What do you think? Should a guy of this age, who's got 15 years until he begins to look at retirement, should he just say, forget diversification and let it fly at the S&P?
I think it was Brian Portnoy, but I'm not sure. Somebody said that diversification means you always have to say you're sorry.
I thought that was marriage.
Well, yeah.
On a very special Peter and Friends.
That's right. So essentially it means, so let's say that S&P 500 over the last 10 years has been bonkers.
Yeah, good bonkers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when you're in a portfolio, even if it's an aggressive model, you've got other groups in there. You've got international, you've got a little bit of fixed exposure, whether it's bonds or cash or anything like that. So you're never going to accurately replicate the S&P 500's performance, which is a good or a bad thing, depending on how the S&P 500 is doing. Unfortunately, we're in a 10-year stretch where if that's your benchmark, which actually brings up another great point, is making sure that your benchmarks are reasonable for what you're invested in. You're going to be disappointed because you're comparing your investments to a benchmark that you're not accurately reflecting in your own investments.
Nicole, do you ever get the feeling he should just host the show and you and I
Yes.
could go out for brunch?
Yeah. Actually, that'd be really nice.
Let's do that. Where do you want to go? Nope. So, you know what? That's a really good point. Damien, do you remember the first time you were exposed to the concept of international investing? I remember it was a first-year broker at MetLife Securities. This is the year 2000. Story time. Do we have story time music? Now I'm telling the story. And I was in this conference room, and the plants were all dying in the conference room because the meetings were typically pretty boring. They could have just been asleep, for all I know. And this guy came in. He was an international wholesaler, and he wanted to pitch us his international fund. He said, "Look around your home." And I was a smart aleck, and I was like, we're at work. He's like, "Look around your home, and what percentage of the items in your home were made overseas?" And everyone's like, I don't know. He's like, "That's right, most of them. So that's why you need international exposure." You know, and that it made sense to me.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
you can't just think that domestic companies are the only opportunity for growth. But Damien, if it's lagging the portfolio and our economy, this is as subjective as it gets, it's doing pretty well in relation to other economies right now. I don't know. I think there's a reasonable argument to say maybe I pull back some of the diversification. Am I giving bad advice on the radio, Damien?
Is your crystal ball working over there, Pete?
Let me check. No. It isn't. It is, bro. I don't know. I'll just say this. I'm less diversified and international than I used to be. That's me. That doesn't make it right. By any means doesn't make it right. But what Austin is suggesting is what I have done probably in the last 5 years. I just said I don't care for the exposure.
No, thank you.
No, you can make a very reasonable argument for being a little bit more U.S. heavy, as long as you're willing to take your lumps when this market turns.
And I think that's where we need to hone in on with this, right? Is Austin, buddy, if you are willing to take your lumps, have at it, do whatever you want. But because still the S&P 500 is somewhat diversified. It's gotten a little wonky these days, but it's somewhat diversified. If you're willing to take your lumps in the next 5 years when it just gets hammered, and with what my faulty crystal ball says, then why not? You know what I mean? But I guess within 5 years, or 5 years by age 50, you probably need to dial that sucker back in to a more reasonable pre-retirement allocation. Would you think so, Damien?
Yeah, you hit on a really good point about the S&P 500 being somewhat diversified. Well, if you look at the list of companies that are covered in the S&P 500, we're not talking about the little mom and pop flower shop down on the corner in your hometown. We're talking about huge companies that have their fingers in economies all over the world. They just happen to be located in America.
You do get international exposure. What do they call that? They call it global exposure, right? Because isn't that the term they use? I should know these things. A company that's domestic can have global exposure. Is that how they say it?
I should probably know that, but I do not.
I heard someone say something cute about it once, and that's what I remember. But I guess so. As we wrap up this segment, I guess the bottom line is this: Austin, you can do it, but you have to be willing to take your lumps. Don't email me back 3 years from now when the S&P's down 40% and say international would have saved me. Be a big boy. If you're going to do it, understand that can happen. Nicole, with 30 seconds left here, did we lose you on any of this? Because you are the voice of the listener. Did we lose you on anything?
No, at first I was starting with the whole year-to-date thing going to the S&P. I was like, I'm a little lost here, guys. These are a lot of letters, but you brought me back.
Yeah, well, that's what Damien does. He brings people back. Coming up after the break, we'll bring you back, and we're going to talk about the weirdest work reimbursement question we've ever gotten. And it's a great question. It's just a weird situation. All that is next, right here on Peter and Friends.